and a group of women from CODEPINK has just returned from Afghanistan. I believe it was Sunday, April 2nd, and they have a report to give us about what's really going on. And two of the women on her trip will be joining her, Sunita Biswang and Kelly Campbell, and Medea will introduce them. Medea is the co-founder of Global Exchange and also CODEPINK and the advocacy organization Unfreeze Afghanistan. And she has been working in the field of Afghanistan for 20 years, and she's seeking compensation for Afghan war victims and raising funds for girls' schools and advocating for an end to the US military intervention, which we know has stopped with boots on the ground, that we're very concerned that the drone warfare may be continuing in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So Medea, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Wonderful. Let me just correct that it wasn't a CODEPINK delegation. It was a delegation of women that were all representing different organizations. We have two of them on the call with us tonight, but we also had Masuda Sultan, who is the co-founder of Unfreeze Afghanistan. She's an Afghan American and has been doing lots of work for the last 20 years together with Sunita, who can talk about that. We had Reverend Dr. Chloe Breyer, who's the director of the Interfaith Center of New York, a wonderful woman who used to head American Jewish World Service, Ruth Messenger, and Daisy Khan, who is a director of Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, who is a great scholar of Islam and did a fabulous job on the trip of talking about how highly Islam values girls' education. So we're gonna go tonight. First, we're gonna have a short video that we did that just gives a little panorama of some of the girls we met and a great song that they sang to us. And then we're gonna have Suni speak, then Kelly, then myself, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So Brian, if you could play that video, and just to let people know, it was a week-long trip, and I think Suni will tell you more about it.
Is it the video first?
Yeah. We decided to go to Afghanistan to learn firsthand how the government's recent decision to close girls' high schools and restrict their education has affected their lives.
خودم محصل بازدید بستم در جایی که من رسیدم مثلا به تلاش خود رسیدم حتی یک قرن پانتون خودم من از خانواده خود نگرفتم وقتی که طالبا آمدن گفتم دیگه خلاص تمام امیدهای ما تمام چیزایی حتی ما یک چنین داشتیم برای ما گفته بودن پلان 5 ساله تن چیز ما گفتیم بطنیم بریم یک زبان خارجی یاد بگیریم مثلا ترکی یا آلمانی یک چیزی پلان 5 ساله برای خود جور کرده بودیم که تمام او پلانای 5 ساله در 2 ماه وقتی که در 2 ماه که طالبا 2 ماه جنگ و طالبا آمد کل سند بین رفت یعنی علی ما تا یک کلاس انگلیسی نداریم چی برسه به کلاس دیگه کلاس های زبان خارجی.
I feel very bad because I cannot go to school. If I do not go to school, I will be illiterate. When I become illiterate, so it means I'm blind. We are blind.
We were so upset listening to the girls and the dashing of their hopes and dreams, but we were also inspired by their courage. Some of them actually going out on the streets to protest, others of them finding ways to study together at home, and all determined that they were going to keep their education going. I think it's important that our government engage with the Taliban to try to get them to reverse this decision, and that we as citizens find ways to support these Afghan girls in their efforts to study, to get good careers, and to help build their society.
Let me talk to you about the way I live, got priorities for them place. I'm a real good girl. You can be cool with me, but just understand I am loyal to my future and I have a master plan. I'm giving all I have to my school work and exams, cause my future's in my hands, can you see? I have a master plan, graduate, oh yes I can. I will go to college and then I will get a good grade for ya. Study and stay up late for ya. I will even get it for ya. You know I do anything for ya. In the same breath, let me say that I'm trying to expand my brain. No one can distract me. I need to educate. Healthy books every night, cause I think it's fun. I like Paul to Newton, I can learn from.
This songs or the lyrics of this song is about we need to educate, and this message is for all the world, and especially for Afghanistan people, that we need to educate, and we really want to open our schools and education centers, and let us to continue our education, and it is really important to everyone, and especially for girls who are leaders of a family, leaders of society, and leaders of the world.
And you must hear my refrains. I am loyal to this learning brain. No one can distract me. I need to educate.
Okay, sorry about the black things that were covering up the subtitles, but I think you get a sense of what we wanted to say there, and these lovely young girls, and how determined they are to get an education. And it's funny because one of the women in our trip has children, I think about the age, and she said, I wish my children were as determined to get an education and valued it as much as the Afghan girls do. We realized when they were singing that it was a song by the US singer Bruno Mars, and Sunita is trying to get in touch with him to see if he would like to donate $1 million to the Afghan girls or something like that. Anyway, we will move to our first speaker tonight, and that is indeed Sunita Biswang. She is a woman of great enthusiasm and tremendous force, and I was so lucky to be able to travel with her. She is one of the founding members of the largest group of women in Afghanistan called Women for Afghan Women. She's also a very committed progressive Hindu faith leader and co-founder of a very important group called Hindus for Human Rights, and went to meet with the Hindu community in Afghanistan. She's also helped us from the very beginning to start the new organization, Unfreeze Afghanistan. So Sunita, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Medea. And being on this Zoom with you and Kelly, I just miss you. It was an intense week, and we had so many experiences, and we became so close, and especially Kelly, because we were roommates too. So this is a wonderful, this is the first time I'm seeing you both. So it's just really, really lovely Thank you all for being here. We're just back. It's been just a few days and we're jet lagged and, and it's overwhelming, everything that we did and packed into just a week in Afghanistan. I myself, I've been a whole number of times to Afghanistan over the last 20 years. The first time was in 2003. And the organization that I co-founded, we started before 9/11, 6 months before 9/11. So the Taliban were actually in power in Afghanistan when I started on this odyssey. And the idea at that time, 21 years ago, was so you have religious extremists in power and you still care about women's rights and human rights. And so what do you do? Before I go into our trip, I think it's important to give a little bit of, just a little bit of background. So Women for Afghan Women, the organization that I co-founded, and I'm a former board chair, I'm not an organization anymore. We founded it and created it, and it still is a grassroots women's organization. And everywhere where the organization works, and this was the vision right from the outset, grassroots means totally, sincerely, in every way, respecting the culture and the faith, and basically wherever the community is, that's where the organization is. The work happens on the terms of the community. And so most people in Afghanistan are Muslim, they're very religious. And so the organization does its work within that context. And so over the 21 years, we built shelters and many different facilities and programs and children's centers across the country in 14 provinces. And everywhere you would go, there would be Quranic classes. There would be the lawyers that came out of the law schools would be trained in Sharia because that was the law of the land in Afghanistan, even before the Taliban takeover, this new Taliban takeover. So the work that we did over the last 2 decades was women's rights within an Islamic framework. That is nothing new in this moment. And so like Women for Afghan Women, there are many women's organizations that did work during these 20 years who have, they have a track record of addressing human rights within an Islamic framework. And as Medea said, Daisy, who is with us, one of our delegates, she's a scholar in women's rights in Islam. And in every meeting that we went, she was able to, debate and dialogue about all the rights that are given to women from the Quran and the Hadiths from the Islamic religion. And those dialogues and conversations, they were very constructive. There were even meetings with government officials, Taliban government officials, where as Medea again mentioned, where there were conversations about what the 700 plus times that the words like pen and book and knowledge are mentioned, and this is just such a strong, robust foundation to argue for women's rights and the right to education. So. What I would like you all to know is that the Afghanistan pre-August 15th, 2021 was one in which it was a religious country, an Islamic republic. Islam was the law of the land. Sharia was the law of the land. The constitution had a sentence that basically said all the laws in this constitution basically defer to Islam. And we were working on women's rights within that context. And there were some very troubling aspects of that. For instance, if a girl or a woman was raped, there was a high chance that she would be jailed because she had committed the crime of zina, which is sex outside of marriage. Also, if there was a divorce, the children were the children would go to the father after a certain age because that was the law. So the work that we did before August 15th was extremely challenging, and we were getting so much traction. We were able to, in a very creative way, bring women and girls to safety, and a woman or a girl who was brutalized and the human rights violation that brought her to our door, we were able to work with that, and in most cases do our work in a transformative way so that that woman or girl was able to see a future for herself. And when I went on this delegation, I haven't been for a few years to Afghanistan because of security reasons. It was just getting more and more dangerous. And if an American went back, our staff in Women for Afghan Women all the facilities would actually be endangered. Not only would we be endangered, but we'd be endangering everyone. So those of us who are American didn't go back for a few years, for at least 5 years. And it meant so much to me to go back because I guess for me and any other women's rights activist at this moment who has spent 2 decades pretty much combating what the Taliban stands for, the question is, what do we do? What do I do? And as a grassroots women's activist, where I get my motivation for, the only place I can get the answer to that question for myself is to go and be with the people, to go into the community and immerse myself. And so I needed to go. And I was grateful for the delegation so that I could go. So I'll move on now. And I'll say one more thing. And there might even, we have such a big audience today, and there may be people here in the audience who are conflicted. It's natural to be conflicted about this. Medea said that the government of this country should engage with the Taliban in order to, I don't know how you put it, Medea, but if we are going to have a discussion about human rights in Afghanistan and a discussion about the moral thing for America to do right now, that conversation means engagement. And I believe before going that engaging is absolutely critical, but going to Afghanistan was for me a vehicle to actually confirm for myself that that is actually what I believe, and that was confirmed for myself. So the ideological impasse is between those who who believe that engaging with the Taliban is basically engaging with terrorists and legitimizing them. And on the other side, people like me believe that since the people of Afghanistan have been delivered a new government, and it was the government of this country that through negotiating with the Taliban over so many years and making them stronger and then leaving and creating the perfect storm for them to become the government and during those talks, making the existing Afghan government weak, not including them in a lot of talks. Here we are, we have the Taliban that took over the country, and that is the reality, and whether we like it or not. And we can, in this country or anywhere else in the world, talk about whether engaging is ethical or not. But we just saw with our own eyes that if you live in Afghanistan, you have no choice. They're in charge. And for instance, many of the meetings that we had, our delegation, we had to get permission. We would have been in terrible trouble if we didn't get permission. Even to get a visa needed engaging. So if any of you in the audience think that that's problematic, I think that's a reasonable position. I just don't share the position because I'm with the people of Afghanistan who don't have a choice. So yeah, the trip that we just took was an advocacy trip. That was one of the main purposes. And the advocacy was going to be about just bearing witness to the situation on the ground. We know that there is a devastating economic and humanitarian crisis going on. I just read an article recently that said that more people are going to die as a result of the poverty, the economic crisis, the near famine situation right now in Afghanistan than in the 20 years of war that preceded it. And so we were going into Afghanistan at this time of crisis. And the idea was that we would learn and listen and come back to our country, to America, to advocate that America gives back the money of the Afghan people, unfreezes the central bank reserves. That was going to be the main advocacy mission. But just before we went to Afghanistan, just before the trip, there was the devastating news that while everybody could go back to school at the beginning of the new term, the high school girls age, grade 7 and up, could not go back to school. And we had a moment of, should we cancel our trip? What should we do? But the entire 8-woman delegation decided that if the situation is worse, it's even more important that we go and express solidarity. And it meant that our advocacy during every meeting was even more robust, because while we were advocating that the US do the moral and ethical thing, we could also have the twin point of the Afghan government also needs to do the moral and ethical thing, which is to let every child in the country have an education. And we made it very clear that in our view, the two issues are not connected. Both stand on their own merit. The Afghans deserve their money back. We have no right to it. And every human being has a right to an education. And neither of those are conditional on anything. So I'll just say, I know that Kelly and Medea will say a lot about the trip, but let me just say a few things. The one other very important mission of this trip was to deliver humanitarian aid. And our amazing delegation, just in a few days, because this decision to go came about very quickly, we were all able to collectively raise more than $60,000. And we were able to, and we had, it's a cash economy, so we're giving cash to people and organizations throughout our week there. And we delivered that $60,000 to women's NGOs and orphanages and schools and individuals that we met who are needy. So that was an incredible, it meant a lot to us to be able to do that. And the fundraising is continuing. We made so many connections, and the unfreeze.afghanistan.org webpage is the place to keep donating. And we will ensure that that money, we now know that it is very easy for us to get the money over to NGOs and to anyone we need to get the money to. My takeaways from the trip. Well, it's a completely mixed bag. It's very, very complex. As I said before, the Taliban is definitely in charge. They are the government, and there's no two ways about that. And so for me, if there was any doubt about this, about what I should do, that doubt has gone away. I stand with the people of Afghanistan, and if they have to deal with this new government, then I'm with them, and I will walk with them through whatever comes. And whatever comes is going to get worse, because the economic crisis is going to get worse. And as the people suffer because of the sanctions that we have placed on them, the hardliners of the Taliban are going to be emboldened, and the other Islamist groups will get emboldened too. And so whatever efforts within the Taliban, and we saw some of them, we met more moderate Taliban representatives who agreed with us. In fact, everyone we spoke to wanted girls to go back to school. Nobody we met agreed with the decision to hold back high school girls from school. And all of those people are fighting hard, and not to legitimize the Taliban, but just to tell the truth. Everybody that we met told us that they were working very hard within the Taliban government to persuade the people, the most conservative of them, who are right at the top, to respect women's rights. And it wasn't just the right to go to school, but they talked about the right of widow remarriage and the right of women to inherit. These are things that they are also fighting for. So we also met women and girls who are very depressed about the new government, about having to wear, now, before it was the blue burqas, now it's very much the black abaya. So girls in Kabul who would wear just, a nice modern outfit and a headscarf are now wrapped up in abayas, and they're very depressed about that. They're depressed about the school situation. Many people told us, please help us evacuate. So all of that was one side. And on the other side, every time we went to a press conference, there were women journalists there. We went to the reopening of the Afghan Women's Chamber of Commerce, and it's filled with women entrepreneurs. And the Minister of Interior spoke about the importance of women to resuscitate the economy. So it was mixed. I mean, it hangs in the balance, and it's hard to be very optimistic. One of the most inspiring things was the two women's organizations we visited, organizations that are doing their work right now under a Taliban government, a shelter and a girls program, the girls program that you just saw in the video. Both of those organizations' leaders are actually, they have American passports. They're American citizens, and they could leave, but they decided to stay. And they have done whatever negotiation they need to with this government to keep their girls and their women safe, and are operating. And they tell us that the Taliban actually have brought them destitute women the shelter to take care of. And so for now, again, anything can change, and they both know that, both of these amazing women. But for now, the fierce leadership of these women is, they're like bulldog leaders, keeping a huge group of women and girls safe. And that was one of the most inspiring things that I took away. That work, if in this crazy, mixed, contradictory moment, work is happening. It is possible. And if it's possible, then I want to be a part of it. And I really have so much more to share, but I'm conscious of time. Thank you for letting me speak here.
Thank you, Sunita. I see that there are some comments like our friend Lauren Steiner saying that the economic situation is more important to deal with than the girls' schools. We try not to put one on top of the other. We think both are absolutely critical, that girls deserve an education, but if their families are too poor to even have them go to school, which is the case for a lot of the families in Afghanistan, then certainly dealing with the economic situation and dealing with the girls' rights to school are part and parcel of the same thing. And I want to turn to Kelly now, because she'll deal more with the economic situation. Kelly is one of the key members of the group September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And she went with us with a very, very important message that she will tell us. But I want to say that her message was so incredibly well received in Afghanistan, that people were so happy that somebody had come from the 9/11 families community to give the message that she was giving, which is not one that they have heard before. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us, and please go ahead and tell us what you came away with.
Well, thanks, Medea. It's great to see you again, and Suni, my roommate from Kabul. The picture behind me is the view off our balcony, so you can see how beautiful a city we really were able to visit. As Medea said, my name is Kelly Campbell. I'm a co-founder of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. We are a group of people who all lost family members in the September 11th attacks, and we've been turning our grief into action for peace and justice for 20 years now. In fact, I'm going to show a few slides, just some photos while I talk. So let me try to figure out how to do that. Let's see. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen yet, am I?
While we're doing that, let me just say, if people want to put questions or comments in the chat, we will be moving on to questions soon.
Okay. All right, are you seeing the screen now?
Yes.
Great. All right, let me put the slideshow up. So I first traveled to Afghanistan, as Medea said, 20 years ago with Medea and other 9/11 family members. This is a photo from 20 years ago when we visited some internally displaced people in a area of Kabul. And on that trip, we were going to meet families whose homes had been bombed by the US, meeting children missing limbs from our cluster bombs in the hospitals in Afghanistan, and really raising up in the US press for the first time the issue of Afghan civilian casualties. Those of you who were around then might remember, the prevalence of the idea that, oh, we were just bombing terrorists, and that this was justified by September 11th, when in fact, we were hurting regular Afghan people who had nothing to do with September 11th. And that was the purpose of our trip 20 years ago. At the same time, we also met girls who were returning to school 20 years ago for the first time ever. You can see the excitement on their faces in this picture. When we asked who wants to be a doctor, everyone raised their hand, because doctors are what they knew as educated people and people that were helping their country. And so it was so exciting 20 years ago to see the enthusiasm that these girls had for being part of their country's future. And so we returned from that trip to share the stories of Afghan civilian casualties and to push for peace, including an Afghan victims fund. So I decided to go on this trip last week because 20 years ago, the Afghan people asked me and asked the international community to not forget about them again. And so it felt like it was very important as the US military has pulled out of Afghanistan for me to remember that as a person and for us as a people to remember that to not forget about our sisters in Afghanistan and the families in Afghanistan just because the US military is not there anymore. So I had hoped, as we all did, to celebrate that week with Afghan families as girls were going back to school. And as you know, unfortunately, that was not the case. The Taliban had issued a decree that all kids could go back to school, and then they turned around the next day and said that junior high school girls were not allowed. And so we did visit, as Suni mentioned and Medea mentioned, with a number of girls in an after school program that basically just turned into a school program. So there's a lot of resilience going on. There's a lot of girls and women finding ways to get around the issues that were going on and be able to still educate themselves and educate each other. These girls in this program, it had been a scouting program and now has really turned into kind of a de facto school. One of their projects was making care packages for other girls. And so they made these packages with books, with school supplies, with encouraging notes to share with girls in their neighborhood, to share with boys in their neighborhood, to give to their sisters, and to really continue to spread education and hope where they could. And so I think it's really exciting to know that, you know, even in this time where they were so depressed, there were also girls that were finding the cracks, right? Like, how do you work through the cracks and still get girls' empowerment, women's empowerment, and education done? And these were an example of some kids that were doing it. And so we did spend a lot of time advocating for girls to return to school. And as Suni said, really everyone we met with, including Taliban officials in the Ministry of Education, agreed with us. In fact, they said, you know, if the Emir decides girls can go back to school at 11 o'clock, at 11:01, we're ready to go. So I think a lot of them that we met had teenage daughters. And I think that, you know, hopefully this will happen. I think it's important for us to put pressure on them as well as the pressure they're getting internally. There was a group of religious leaders last week while we were there, a group of Afghan religious leaders who also issued a statement saying that girls should go back to school. So I think that they are getting some pressure, and that's good. We also met young women who had just graduated from medical school on the left. That's me on the far left, and the girl with the red scarf is now going to be a general surgeon. It was really fun. They just ended up to be having a graduation ceremony at our hotel while we were there, and they all wanted selfies with us. So it was really exciting to meet tons of young women, you know, who were planning to stay in Afghanistan and be doctors, and young men as well, I should add. And they all were really excited to see us, and were really, it was fun to get to celebrate with them. So there were some signs of hope, despite the hardships and the depression that teenage girls were going through. One of them did mention to me in a small group that we were talking to that, you know, the Taliban came in and they took the color out of their lives, right? So they're making, most girls are wearing all black on the outside now. And just thinking about, you know, as a teenage girl being, having the color taken out of your life is really kind of a chilling message. The other purpose of our trip was really to focus on freezing the Afghan central bank funds that are being held mostly in the US and somewhat in Europe. And so it's clear from what we saw this week that Afghanistan is in need of its central bank funds to get the economy going. So this is a photo here of a bread line. We saw this almost every day outside of bread stores. So what happens here is that someone will go in and buy a piece of bread, and they will typically people will buy a second one if they can afford it to give to a woman who's out here waiting. And then also at the end of the day, the bakery will generally give away the bread that's left. So we saw women sitting there all times of the day. You'll see a lot of them are wearing the blue burqa. I would say on the street, we saw maybe 1 out of every 10 women wearing the burqa. Most other women are wearing a headscarf or a dress like the other women you can see here that are not in the burqa. That's different than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I remember before I went to Kabul reading in major newspapers in the US that all the women were throwing off their burqas and we'd freed the women from their burqas. And that simply wasn't the case 20 years ago. When we got there, We spent 10 days in Kabul, and we saw one woman once on the street not wearing a burqa. We were so excited, and then we realized, oh, she was this total kick-ass women's rights activist that we had met with the other day. So so there are many changes over 20 years in terms of the situation for women. So the Afghan central bank reserves, most of you on this call probably know, but I'll just review some of the basics. So when the Taliban took power, the central bank reserves that were in foreign countries were frozen. So we have about $7 billion of the Afghan central bank here in the US. It's now been consolidated into the New York Federal Reserve. There's another about $2.5 billion in several countries in Europe. That money is also basically frozen. When the Biden administration said that half the funds would go to the benefit of the Afghan people, so about $3.5 billion, and that they were setting aside or not trying to move the other $3.5 billion because it has a writ of attachment on it from a small group of 9/11 families who have a lawsuit. They got a judgment against the Taliban in 2012 for quite a bit of money. In fact, their original judgment was for almost $7 billion. This was for 150 plaintiffs representing 47 families. So a very small percentage of all the 9/11 families. As you know, there were nearly 3,000 people killed that day. Frankly, it was a bit of a fluke that these lawyers had gone ahead and gotten a judgment against the Taliban in 2012. Many of the other 9/11 family lawsuits never bothered to do that because it takes a bunch of time and money to go through that. And of course, the Taliban didn't show up in court to defend themselves. And so they got this judgment there. So we've really looked into this at 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, and it's very clear that this money does not belong to 9/11 family members. It does not belong to the United States. It does not belong to the Taliban. It belongs to the people of Afghanistan. And part of a huge part of the economic problems that are going on there are happening because they have no functioning central bank. So the issue of people getting money out of the bank, people who have money in their bank accounts are still only able to get $200 or $400 out at a time. We did not see the lines at the bank that had been there until recently. What we learned while we were there is that banks have taken to basically making appointments. So instead of standing in line, you may have to take an appointment and wait days and days to get your money out. And again, not to be able to get very much out at a time. So we believe that the 9/11 family lawsuit that does have the judgment, and now there are a bunch of other lawsuits trying to pile on. From talking to lawyers and reading all the legal documents, we really don't believe that they have legal standing. Unfortunately, unless the Biden administration issues another executive order to say, in the interest of foreign policy, we are going to take that money out from under this writ of attachment. It may be tied up in the courts for a very long time. So I think I can go into more detail in the Q&A about this if people are interested, but it gets really legally complex. But the fact of the matter is that morally, this is not our money. And so there's absolutely no reason that this should be used to settle 9/11 family lawsuits, particularly when we're in the situation where Afghan people's economy is going down the tubes. And this is why, is because they don't have access to this money. Let's see. So we, when we were there, our delegation did meet with the directors of the central bank. This is on the left is a picture outside of, it's called DA Afghanistan Bank. So DAB is sort of the acronym used, and we did meet with them and we did discuss this issue with them. And it's interesting to note that the Taliban themselves will tell you this is not the Taliban's money. So if this money and when this money gets returned to Afghanistan, they don't have rights to actually, go and use that as their own personal Taliban slush fund. It actually belongs to the central bank, which has a governing board that has the same people on it that were on it in the previous administration. And I've learned more about banking than I ever really wanted to know because of the situation. But, central banks tend to be sort of quasi-governmental. They're not really run by the government. And so there are a lot of ways that there can be checks and balances to make sure that this money is actually going to what it's intended to do. So our delegation, while we were there, met with Afghans from all walks of life, including girls and young women, female teachers and doctors, reporters, women and men reporters, We met with Afghan NGO workers, women in shelters, destitute families receiving food distribution. While we didn't travel outside of Kabul, we actually did have people come from other provinces to meet with us. And so, for instance, we met with two men who drove from Kandahar and said this was the first time they felt safe to drive themselves in their own car from Kandahar in 20 years. In the past, they either didn't come to Kabul or they flew because it was so unsafe. So there is a difference in safety on the ground, but we did meet with people from outside of the country or outside of the capital city who were able to talk to us more about the situation that is so dire in the provinces as well. We witnessed signs of severe economic distress, including middle-class families that were selling their furniture on the street in order to eat. These women sitting here for the bread lines, malnourished children, and many unemployed or underemployed workers. So for instance, our drivers and fixers, talking to them, one of them had worked for the Ministry of Finance in the previous government. One of them had worked for an NGO. One of them had worked for the cricket board. And now they were scrambling to find freelance work, driving people around for 5 days. So the middle class has really been hollowed out. People who can leave have left, and those who have stayed, are by and large don't have the jobs. One of the things one of our drivers said to us was, in the previous administration, we had jobs, but no security. And now we have security, but no jobs. So we really saw how the not having the Afghan central bank funds is a major reason for the country's economic collapse. So even officials from the acting government were clear to us, as I mentioned, that this is not Taliban money. This is money that belongs to the people of Afghanistan and should be returned to the central bank itself. So consistent with our mission, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows is continuing to seek justice for the Afghan people who find themselves in a dire humanitarian and economic situation that's been exacerbated by the freezing of this $7 billion of their money in our country. And that the withholding of these funds, may lead to a failed state situation in Afghanistan. And that certainly has negative consequences, not only for the people of Afghanistan, but potentially for the rest of the world. I will say that members of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, along with our partners in Unfreeze Afghanistan, have been speaking out in the press, have been talking to our own government. We're hoping to get a congressional briefing going soon. We are pursuing legal action to help ensure that the Afghans get access to their own funds. So I was really glad to be on this trip in order to talk to Afghans. And this is a picture of our really epic press conference. I wish we had press conferences like this in the US. We had 7 speakers at 3 minutes each, but it had to be translated into Dari and Pashto as well. And so it was an 1.5-hour long press conference with, I am not exaggerating, at least 26 cameras there and at least like 40 different reporters from different outlets, a lot of them Afghan and other regional outlets that were there. They sat through an 1.5-hour long press conference. They didn't leave early and they stayed to ask questions. So that was pretty incredible. And I think our message was well received by Afghans. And the idea that that we in the US, that there are people in the US, we are not all trying to steal their money, that there are many of us who are working to get their money back to them. So I hope that you all here tonight can help us by going to unfreezeafghanistan.org, getting involved and helping with the efforts to ensure that Afghan people have access to their own money. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful, Kelly. Thank you so much. I see we have a lot of good questions and we'll get to that very soon. And I might touch on them just in some comments before we open up. I think that Fahima, you brought up in the comments that that Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. I think it's important to recognize that none of the hijackers were from Afghanistan, and that the majority of the Afghan people were not even born at the time of those attacks. It's a very young population. In fact, we were told that a number of young people don't even know what happened 20 years ago. What we're advocating is the unfreezing the funds, and we're doing that by going to our members of Congress. We're going to do a congressional briefing next week and try to set up individual meetings with members of Congress. And if any of you have good relationships with your Congress people, please let us know about that. And the other is trying to go directly to the White House. We're trying to get a meeting with the US envoy for Afghanistan, Tom West, as well as other people in the State Department. But there is more to it than just the unfreezing of the money. And somebody did ask in the chat, are there other issues that affect the dire economic situation? And it's important to recognize that in 20 years of occupation, the US and the West set up a totally unsustainable economy that 75% of the government expenditures were dependent on foreign aid. And so that money immediately dried up. So imagine if the money for the government fund disappeared, and on top of that, the reserve funds that were being held in US banks as well as some in Europe, 9 billion total, were frozen. How difficult it is to have an economy that's functioning. On top of that, there are sanctions that make it difficult to use the banking system at all, which is why it's so much a cash economy now, but very little cash because the government has not been able to get dollars brought into the country. And so this affects businesses that can't get money out to pay their employees. And it also affects poor people because we met a very poor elderly woman on the street who came up to us crying, saying that she couldn't get her pension because she couldn't get it out of the bank. So it affects all kinds of people. And then there's the issue of humanitarian aid. It is such a dire situation. Somebody had put in the chat that there are even examples of families selling their children. The desperation is so deep that selling a child in order to be able to feed the other members of the family, you can imagine how destitute a family has to be to reach that conclusion. But that is happening, and there is increasing malnutrition, tremendous unemployment, inflation because of the economic situation. It's deceiving because the booths and the stores look like they're well stocked. And indeed they are, and part of it is because people just don't have the money to buy the goods. So the issue of humanitarian aid is an important one, and the UN just had another round of trying to get the international community to cough up the money that's needed, and they've been trying to raise $4.4 billion. And in total, they have just over 2 billion. So a lot of that money is not forthcoming. And the United States had spent, according to Joe Biden, $300 million a day, every day for 20 years on the war in Afghanistan. But we have not even given 2 days worth to the humanitarian fund. So that's another thing that we're saying to our elected officials is we have a responsibility. In fact, we should be paying reparations. But right now, let's just say we should be giving much more money to the UN appeal. And the other is development aid. How is the country going to get back on its feet? And there is something that just happened very interesting this week, that the Taliban edicts have usually been so negative, like closing down the high schools, like saying that women could not travel outside the country without a male guardian, like saying that men who work in the civil service in the government will have to grow beards. But there was actually a very good edict that came out this week, and that is that the Taliban has said that they will not allow people to grow poppy and be part of this drug trade. Now, this is something that has caused tremendous problems all over Europe and Iran because Afghanistan is responsible for over 80% of the opium. And the US had a program that spent billions of dollars, billions of our tax dollars to try to eradicate poppy growing. And instead, it just went up and up during the time of the US. When the Taliban was in power in the 1990s, they did get rid of, I think, 90% of the poppy production. So they have the ability to do it because the farmers are afraid of the Taliban. And it's not as corrupt a regime as the one that the US had put in place. So when they made this announcement, they said that they wanted and needed the help of the international community to find ways for the farmers to transition to other kinds of crops like wheat and pomegranates. And this is a tremendous opportunity for the US and other countries to do something that will change the face of agriculture in Afghanistan and have it be a much more productive and sustainable type of agriculture. So these are three things that we think are important to talk to our elected officials about. And finally, just to mention a couple of things that people brought up in the questions before you get to the ones you see, Brian. I wanted to address Ken Mayers, who has been to Afghanistan, and probably others on this call, with the Afghan youth volunteers. It's very sad that many of them have left the country. They did not feel safe. But we did meet with some who are still there, had great meetings with them, brought them some financial support, and hope to continue to be in contact with them. And we also met with, Sunita, you might mention the group that did the peace walk that Sunita was very involved in supporting, and those young people also feel threatened. It's not a time where they feel they can get involved in the peace work, although we have seen that young women have been out on the streets protesting the closing of schools. And as time goes by, we probably will see more people getting involved in acts of civil disobedience. Sunita, did you want to mention something about that?
Just the People's Peace Movement. It was a youth movement, and many of you may have read about them in the New York Times, where they were the group they're from southern Afghanistan, from Helmand, Kandahar, and they did these huge walks all the way across the country, saying that we're done. We don't care if you're the government, if you're the Taliban, we don't care who you are. We're done with war. We want an end to fighting, end to all this divisive, violent politics. We just want peace. And they everywhere they went. I mean, we've seen so many videos and photographs of them. People in villages would just join them and feed them and walk with them. And it was a movement that was inspired by Gandhi and Badshah Khan, who's known as Frontier Gandhi, who is a Muslim interfaith pacifist from the, 1920s or something. And then he became a friend of Gandhi. And of course, Badshah Khan is called a Gandhian, but actually Badshah Khan had this philosophy and was doing this work before he met Gandhi, and then they met. So these were the influences on these young people. And when we met them, it was, we actually encouraged them. We gave them some support. But what was really hard was that they were completely demoralized. They fought so hard with a vision of peace, and their end goal was not Taliban Afghanistan, but we gave them some support and some encouragement, and tried to get their chin up, but they're demoralized. I don't have a positive spin on their mood.
So Sunita, maybe you could put the name of the person you're referring to as an inspiration in the chat, so we can learn more about him. And Brian, we'll pass it to you.
Thanks. And there were a lot of great questions in the chat, so let's get right into them. Steve asks about the different situation for women living in rural areas versus urban areas, and if there are and also if there are unique women's issues caused or intensified by the assets freeze. And I'm going to put everyone up on the screen as well.
So Sunita, since you have the women-to-women experience, you want to take that?
The question of urban versus rural.
Yeah.
We were in this meeting with the Ministry of Education, the Deputy Minister of Education, and we were asking him, when will the schools open? Because he said they would open. So we said, when? And he started to explain to us about this urban-rural divide, and that for the unity of the nation to just have either schools open in some regions and not others, or to force sort of the views and the preferences of urban Afghans on the rural Afghans. Both of those would harm the unity of the nation and would lose support for the government and maybe empower other militias and so forth. So that's where they told us about going out and dialoguing with the more conservative factions about not just schools, but the other aspects of women's rights. And I asked, based on my experience before, and Fahima will probably attest to this too, that even in rural Afghanistan, people wanted to send their girls to school. This was not an issue. Maybe there were people who didn't, but there were many people who did. And I reminded them that in rural southern Afghanistan, I don't know when, maybe 15 years ago, there were incidents of throwing acid on schoolgirls and attacking girls' schools. And families just kept sending their girls to school. And that was this very resilient rural Afghan expression from history. So I guess I'm saying that I didn't fully buy the argument about the urban versus rural fully. But that was their explanation.
So could we unmute Fahima, who has built girls' schools in the countryside, and let her address some of these? Fahima, maybe do you need to unmute her, Brian? Yeah.
Oh, thank you, ladies, and thank you, gentlemen. Wow, that is a beautiful, beautiful program. And Sunita, after so long, well, great. And Medea, thank you for going there, and all of you. Yes, I talked to some schools in Shibarghan and Mazar. They said that the high school, the girls' high school in Mazar and Shibarghan and some other provinces. I did not get the name of other provinces, but in these two provinces, Mazar and Shibarghan, the girls' high schools are open. And I talked to one of the Taliban official in Nangarhar and Jalalabad. In Achin, we opened a school last year. We built a school actually last year. That's the area where the mother of all bomb was dropped. Our school is elementary school, but the Taliban official told us that very soon would be high school, and they will be using the school in the evening for community college. And this is something that they say that the order has been issued, and they will be using that for girls' community college, the school. So what I'm saying is that, yes, in some areas, the schools are open. The high school for girls are open. And for sure, I know Mazar Sharif and Shibarghan.
We also heard that from some of the Taliban officials in the Ministry of Education, that there were several provinces that were running high school girls. And we should say that private schools as well, there are private schools where high school girls are going to school right now. But obviously that's not something everyone can afford.
But the funny thing is that the colleges are open for girls and high schools are not. I just don't know what is the story behind this.
Absolutely. I mean, for us to meet with these wonderful new graduates for medical school, and to think that right now there's no way to get to medical school if you can't go to high school. So it really will have to change.
Oh, another good question from the chat. Is there a popular sport with girls in Afghanistan? And there's a suggestion that we should perhaps have a drive to get sports equipment to the country. That's from Fahim.
Kelly, you want to take that?
So we did meet with some of these girls who had been athletes. One of them had been, I think, on the national volleyball team. Is that right? But we met with some girls who were athletes, and now they're very frustrated because the program that they're in luckily has one small room with a couple of treadmills and exercise bikes that they can do. But there were girls talking about how they used to run, how they used to ride bikes, and now they're really feeling unsafe and unable to do those things and unable to play their sports. So I think that's going to be a challenge as long as these girls are feeling so restricted that they're not able to, to participate in a lot of activities that they would like to do as well, including sports.
Thanks. A couple of people actually asked Nancy and Susan from the chat about safety issues on the delegation and what that experience was like.
We talked a lot about security before we went, and our families were extremely worried about us going, understandably. But I think everybody would agree that pretty much from the moment we got there, it's always like that. Once you go to a place, I mean, the security concerns are much more exacerbated from afar. Once you're there, it's diminished. And I've been a number of times, and I must say that on previous trips, there was more of an edge in the air where something could happen. And on this trip, I didn't feel scared. I really didn't, not even once. And people told us that, I mean, people kept telling us that as much as there are negative aspects of what has happened, one positive aspect is that it seems safer and more peaceful. People talk about being able to drive to other cities and other provinces without worrying about mines and bombs and so forth. And this was stated to us over and over again by different people. I must say that when we left, a few days after we left, there was a marketplace in Kabul where somebody threw a hand grenade and a whole load of people were injured. I don't think anybody died. So we were going to markets, so it's not that there is no danger, but we weren't scared and it didn't feel particularly insecure. Would you agree, Medea, Kelly?
Oh, absolutely. We had bulletproof cars, and the proof that they were bulletproof is that there was one bullet that you could see that hit the car and didn't break the glass.
Not with us in it.
Not with us in it.
Yeah.
Yes. Somebody wrote, are people safer now that the US military is gone? Well, they're safer because there's not the same level of fighting going on. We did ask about ISIS, and they said that that they don't think it's very strong. And so people are definitely more secure in being able to walk around. There are members of the Taliban, the young ones, out on the streets all over the place with their guns. And it is kind of disconcerting how quickly it becomes the norm to see these guys with their guns out on the street. But I must say they were quite respectful to the population and to us. Even if they stopped us for something, it wasn't to yell and scream. It was just to talk in a nice tone. And I think they've been getting some orders from above on how to treat the population. There are lots of examples, and in some cases rumors of retaliation against people who had been working with the Afghan military and the US government. And many of those people were evacuated, and others are still in Afghanistan, and they feel very insecure, they're scared, they're still trying to get out. But we also did hear examples that I find quite remarkable of people who worked with the Afghan government, who were in the military fighting the Taliban, who stayed behind because they had nowhere to go, their families couldn't leave, and are now have been given other jobs, including in the police department. So without any kind of peace and reconciliation commission, to really air all these things and have the kind of long process that you've seen in countries like South Africa, it is remarkable that for the large part, people are living side by side next to people who just a year ago were trying to kill each other.
And I will say, I mean, people did say security felt better, but they also weren't sure how long that was going to last. And I think that comes from just the experience of the past 43 years in this country, right? So while people I think felt safer or said they felt safer, they also weren't sure how long that was going to last. And so there's still a little bit of a skepticism about that.
And when the Taliban came in the 90s, in the beginning, people welcomed them for the same reason, and how quickly that changed.
I think Cynthia just asked a really good question in the chat, and that's with the assets frozen, are people getting paid for the work that they're doing?
It's very erratic. There are months that have gone by where they didn't get paid. Now some of them are getting paid via UN agencies like UNICEF that is paying for the teachers, or a World Bank program that's paying for the healthcare workers. But the government has, well, there are a total of hundreds of thousands of people who are working in one way or another in government jobs. And the government does not have enough money to pay them. Even the Taliban themselves are not getting paid from what we heard. And so imagine these guys with guns on the streets and not getting salaries. It is a pretty dicey situation.
Thanks. And I just do want to give a time check. I want to make sure that everybody still has time. Time for one more question or two, or
should we go for a couple of minutes more?
Yes, if that's all right with everyone. This isn't a question, but I thought it was actually a really good suggestion, so I want to get your reaction. This was from early on when we were watching the video. Diane Perlman suggests, you had mentioned, Medea, that we should get Bruno Mars to donate $1 million. Diane is suggesting that Bruno Mars should do a version of his song with the young women that we saw.
That's what I wrote in my email. Not that he would do it with them, but just record the song. So let's see. Let's see if we can get that.
So whoever knows Bruno Mars, please put that in the chat and we'll follow up with you.
Most people here probably never heard of him.
He has 43 million Twitter followers.
I could certainly raise some awareness. I'm sure if we could get to him, I mean, how could you pass on such a great idea? But we should make that effort. Michael asked earlier if men, young men and boys are standing in solidarity with Afghan girls and young women and refusing to go to school unless their female classmates can go.
I don't think so.
Well,
that'd be great if they were.
Yeah, it would be great if they were. And in fact, there were people in our group that were encouraging the fathers to get out on the streets with their daughters and just go outside the schools and stand there in solidarity. And, you know, maybe things like that will evolve. But as of now, they thought they were going to be going back to school. So this is really a very new shock.
Tamara asked earlier if the situation in Yemen is at all similar to the situation in Afghanistan.
Well, I would say it's similar in the fact that we don't hear about it. Now, with all of the attention on Ukraine, people do wonder why we haven't heard about Yemen for the last 7 years. And why the aftermath of the US pullout is just silence when it comes to the US media. And then there's also the issue about refugees, how hard it is now still for Afghans to get out of the country. how even if they have the right visas to come to the United States, they're having a very hard time, and not so much because the Taliban won't let them leave, but because the excruciatingly difficult US bureaucracy that they have to deal with. And then there's a lot of stories about Afghans suffering here in the United States and not getting the kind of support they need to integrate into society, versus how Ukrainian refugees are being so warmly welcomed. And when it comes to Yemenis, I think it's been very hard, well, geographically very hard for Yemenis to go anywhere, because where are they going to go, to Saudi Arabia? Those kind of comparisons, I think, are important to make between wars like in Yemen and in Ukraine, and the aftermath of these terrible 20-year, well, 43-year war in Afghanistan, where there's so little attention paid to reparations.
Thanks. And thanks to Sherry for just highlighting a question that I had missed. But Sherry's asking, along with David Wildman, about the situation for ethnic minorities in Afghanistan.
Sunita, I think you can talk to that.
In this particular week, I didn't really meet anybody who talked to me about that issue. Overall, in Afghanistan, it's always, there are certain ethnic minorities who are targeted with discrimination. But I didn't come across this issue this particular week. Did you?
Well, we asked about it, and you hear very different things. You hear that the government has said it will respect the rights of all minorities, but it also had said that it was going to include those minorities in a more comprehensive government, which it didn't do. And it didn't bring the minority groups in, and it didn't bring any women into any significant positions in government. We feel that that's still an important issue to be pushing the Taliban on, that they have to be more inclusive.
We did visit a different kind of minority, a tiny, tiny, tiny little group of Hindus and Sikhs. We went to the Hindu temple and the Gurudwara, and there's only, they say, about 160 people left from the community. They're mostly Sikh and a few Hindus. And again, it's just what people report, and it could change any day, but they reported that they feel safe, and that they want to get out of the country because there's no prospects, and they want their children to go to school, and they don't have money, and they don't have an ability to earn right now. But they told us that they did not feel unsafe, and in fact, there are people from the authorities come and check on them periodically. So this is what we heard.
Well, that is good to hear. David and Jan just put an interesting, good question, and then this is probably more for the audience than it is for you. But asking if people on the call could help get opportunities for you all to share your experience about what you saw on the delegation. And I'll just ask, how many opportunities have you had to get this word out?
Well, we just got home, and I think that's a great question for us to wrap up on, because we do want to speak wherever we can, and there are 7 of us who are available. So any of you who have faith-based groups that you would like someone to speak to, community groups, any universities, whatever, please contact us, and maybe we should put our emails in the chat right now. And then also we are continuing to do the work of congressional pressure. So as I mentioned, if you have any good contacts in your among your representatives, let us know. We are going to continue to raise money for the girls' programs. And maybe we could put that once more into the chat. Oh, and my goodness, we have Kathy Kelly on. I didn't know Kathy was here. And I think we should give Kathy a chance to say something. She's done so much amazing work over the years. with Afghan peace groups.
Oh, well, thank you, Medea, and all of you. I think that this is a testament to moral imagination. You know, we have to imagine our way beyond these terrible wars and the cruelty and the division that they cause. And I know personally that at least 4 young friends of mine were thrilled to meet with you. So thank you very, very much for being the true ambassadors, diplomats, and let's be followers together. Thank you.
Here, here.
Thanks, Kathy. If I can put in one more plug, I know you all have just been on this webinar, but this whole delegation was amazing, and we're all going to be speaking on a webinar on Monday evening. And it should be up on the Unfreeze Afghanistan website. So if you have friends that missed this, or if you want to hear from the other delegates, that would be a good way to hear kind of more perspectives on the trip.
Absolutely. Each one came away with different things, saw different things, have different aspects to talk about. So yes, please join us again on Monday and tell your friends. I will, oh good, we've got it in the link there. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, Mary asks a very important question, and that is, how do we donate? And the link is right there in the chat, www.codepink /unfreeze_Afghanistan. And I'll be sending out that link as well in a follow-up email. And I encourage you to not only follow that link, but to share it out to all of your friends and family. So
one of the beautiful things where that one of the places we will continue to send money to is that they felt that the girls in their neighborhoods were so depressed that they had a group that was coming together to help each other. But for the isolated girls in their area, they made up these beautiful love packets. And they had each one 2 different books so they could share the books with each other. They had pens and pencils and letters of encouragement. And then they also had a notebook asking the girls to write down their feelings, like a kind of diary. So helping them get these packets is something that we will spend some of the funds on.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think it's getting late and you've had a long trip. It's time for everybody to get some rest, and we'll be looking for you on Monday night. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.